At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an everyday luxury home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. In this series, we explore how designed spaces impact our lived experience and day-to-day life. Our aim is to help you understand what makes a space fulfilling and provide a scientific framework along with expert insights to help you create spaces that enhance your well-being. We delve into the entire spectrum of designed spaces, from our brain's relationship with aesthetics to finding the right designers, lighting systems, and objects that support your well-being. Ultimately, we examine how the spaces we inhabit can enrich our ability to be present and connect with others. Join us.
Welcome to episode 7 of the From Brain to Home series. This is part 1 of our episode with guests Hannah and Alyssa. Alyssa Gerasimoff graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2020 with a degree in furniture design. After graduating, she spent 3 years working with social impact organizations on communication and creative strategy. During this time, she saw many of her RISD peers face significant challenges in launching their creative careers, and those observations led her to launch Erria in 2023. Erria, spelled E-R-R-I-A, is now preparing for its relaunch in 2025 as a marketplace connecting consumers with top-tier makers and designers. Hannah Bigeleisen designs sculptural furniture and lighting in Brooklyn, New York. Her rich understanding of material, form, color, and texture lends itself to collections that are highly crafted and designed for a lifetime of joy and inspiration. Hannah founded her Brooklyn-based design practice in 2020 after debuting her first lighting collection at Brooklyn Designs. Her work has been published in Domino magazine, Architectural Digest, Elle Decor, Vogue magazine, Luxe magazine, and Interior Design magazine. She has most recently shown her new collection at Collectible New York, and her newest collection will debut at Wanted Design in 2025. You can learn more about Hannah and Alyssa at the links in our show notes. Ashley is joined by me, Dylan Williamson, to co-interview Hannah and Alyssa. Enjoy.
Alyssa and Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. We're extremely excited to be talking with you both today. We always like to start hearing a little bit about where you grew up and what kind of kid you were. So Alyssa, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So glad to be here. I grew up to 2 Russian immigrant parents about an hour outside of New York City in a city called Stamford in Connecticut. Had, I would say, a relatively average suburban upbringing. Maybe one of the most notable factors was that my parents both spoke English as their second language, so that was definitely pretty prominent in my upbringing as well. Maybe the most relevant thing to this conversation is that art and culture is really important in Russian society, so I definitely grew up with a mom that went out of her way to take us into New York City, to different museums, to the ballet, to the opera. I also, growing up, never really considered a creative path as a viable one for the future. I also think due to the nature of growing up outside of New York City, it felt like, everyone who I grew up with is now in finance or business or potentially engineering. And I had originally thought that I would go down the engineering route because no one ever told me that it would be okay to go to art school. And I also had one particular art teacher who actually told me to apply to RISD just for fun. And he said, if you get in, you know that you're good enough and you know that you don't want to go anyway. And if you don't, who cares? You don't want to go. So it was a huge shock, I think, for me and for everyone around me that I ended up going down the path that I did. I unexpectedly studied furniture design, and that was kind of the beginning of my journey to where I am today.
And we will look forward to hearing a lot more about that. Thank you so much. Hannah, can you share a little bit?
So similar to Alyssa, my parents were both really big advocates for arts and culture also growing up, but I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my family moved around a lot. My dad was really unwilling to compromise his happiness for a job, and whenever he felt like work became unbalanced, he looked for a new position. We lived in Minnesota, Atlanta, did a very quick stint up in Anchorage, Alaska, and then in Rochester, New York. And my parents have continued to move around after that. So they were in Baltimore, went back to Pittsburgh for a little bit, and now are in Connecticut and are soon moving to Syracuse. So moving around a lot is kind of, we joke, but that really influenced me as a kid because I was able to see a lot of different ways that people were living and a lot of different places that people lived in. I think that even though my parents were really big proponents of the arts growing up, I didn't consider myself an artist. I loved it, but I didn't really understand that that could be a viable career for me until I was much older in high school. And it wasn't until my junior year that I took a studio course. Art when I was growing up was really taught as like drawing a still life. And I was not good at that. And my teachers were really adamant about telling me that I was not good at drawing a still life. That's kind of a barometer for what makes an artist. I had a professor in 11th grade who really gave me a lot of freedom to make things. And that was when I started to really consider myself an artist and consider the possibility of being an artist later on in life. I think because of that, I've always just kind of been a little weirdo. As an artist, you develop your own kind of personal universe sometimes, and kind of moving around really gave me a lot of food for fodder, essentially, to develop that.
And what a gift that your dad gave you.
Absolutely.
In not just the moving around and getting to see different things, which I could also imagine could be challenging because you're constantly starting anew and you have to make new friends and start at a new school, but this sense that he wasn't willing to compromise his happiness for a job is so rare in the United States, I feel like, and such a gift. And hopefully you feel like that sort of like seeped into your being as well.
That sort of leads into the next question. I had a similar experience. I also went to RISD, and, you know, it's this huge process of getting in, and then you get there, and sometimes you study something totally random, and it's sort of this blip, and then, you know, maybe it's disconnected to the rest of your creative practice. So I'm curious, both in education and then outside of education, how you both arrived to your current practices and what they look like.
You know, I went to art school because my mom, this is so crazy because I feel like most of the time I hear that parents are like, why would you ever go to art school? My mom really nagged me. She got called by a recruiter from the Cleveland Institute of Art who had seen a sketchbook of mine. And she was like, Hannah, you have to apply to art school. And I was like, Mom, what do you know? This is not a thing. Like, what are you talking about? Art school's not a thing. And she's like, no, honey, this is like a college. You can study art there. You should apply. And I took a look at it and I was like, okay, why not? You know, it was like 2 weeks before the semester started. And I had graduated a year early from high school. It was just really not a good fit for me. So I took a bunch of courses at a community college and I was done. I was like, I'm done and I'll look for college when I'm ready. I'm really grateful that my mom really pushed me in this direction. I applied and I got in and I studied fine art. I had this foundations teacher, Barbara Stanczek, who is the wife of Julian Stanczek, an op art painter. She herself is a fabulous sculptor. She was really influential in my, not career, because you're 17 when you go to college or whatever, but in the direction of my study. Just watching her work with materials was so inspiring to me. She taught me how to mix plaster and cement and work with these materials. She really spent a lot of time with me, and I'm really indebted to that. And that really influenced me. I studied sculpture and printmaking in undergrad, and I had a minor in critical theory. I really loved one of my teachers there who was a critic and a curator, and I had access to a really philosophical background at a young age, which I think was really influential to me. And, you know, when you get out of school, you're really young, even though you don't feel like you are. You're like, I'm an adult. Oh my God, I'm going to make it. And I was a little naive in that, but I think that that was the kind of energy I needed to enter New York City as a 21-year-old. And I started working for some really well-known female sculptors, Katrin Sigurdardottir and Orly Ganger. And that was tremendously influential to me to see these women who are, you know, in their 40s at the time, making these monumental pieces and finding tremendous success in them. And I found that just like, okay, if they can do this, that means that there's a space where I can do this. And I was also teaching. I found that teaching when I was younger was really important to me. I just really wanted to share my knowledge of things that helped shape my life at an early age. And I wanted young people to know that art was a viable place for them to explore. So I kind of vacillated between these two worlds of education and fabrication before I went to graduate school. And when I got out, I had a really challenging experience at RISD, and I really wanted to focus on education. It was also when Donald Trump was elected for the first time, which we are seeing that reflected. And I'm similarly feeling a call to continue to enter back into the role of educator to help young people navigate this time period in the arts. Working in education is really a dedication to others. And I had only very little time in my studio. It allowed me to afford a studio in New York, but it gave me very little time for my creative practice. And I found that my practice really had to shift, and the modes of expression that I found, instead of really thinking about, in graduate school, you have all of the time in the world. You just work and that's it. And you have no other responsibilities, which is amazing. At the time it feels crushing, but looking back, you're like, oh, what a joy. So, the main proponents of my practice became efficiency. And that's not really a way to continue to build things in a sustainable manner or to even explore your interests. There were a few really important conversations that I was having with curators at the time about light in my work and shadow. And at the same point, my husband is a designer. And since we've been together, he has been encouraging me to enter into the world of design since we were 18. We met when we were freshmen in college. And, he was always like, this has so many applications outside of the fine art world. And I was really resistant to that for a while until I saw what the design community is like. And it is such a vibrant place of conversation and crossover and fruition. And after those conversations, I was really thinking about it, and I was able to build and produce my first piece of lighting, which I debuted at Brooklyn Designs right before 2020. And I had some success with that show, and I just thought, okay, if this is replicable, this will allow me to kind of shift into a full-time position in my studio, which has been my goal since I was really young. And it was kind of through there that opened the door to working in the studio full-time. So it's there's never a straight path to where you are. I would never have imagined tiny baby 18-year-old Hannah making furniture for a living, but I could not be happier being able to express myself in this way. It's a gift to be able to have people live with your work in such an intimate way.
Alyssa, do you want to talk a little bit about your site and what you're doing, your mission, and then you can talk about how the two of you guys met as well?
Yeah, that's a fun story too.
I can start maybe with just, speaking a little bit to how I got from the RISD furniture program to now starting a tech company, essentially. But I actually have a funny story when I first got to RISD, because it was a little bit unexpected that I would go to art school, and I thought that I would be an engineer. It was a little bit assumed that I would either study industrial design or perhaps architecture. And at the end of freshman year, I decided to study furniture instead. And my parents were not happy about it. I wrote them a 5-paragraph email outlining why I changed my mind. And I remember someone had given me the advice of pick your major, not based on what you want to design, but the kinds of people you want to be surrounded by. And I feel like that advice has sort of come and gone as being relevant, but I think now it's sort of here to stay as being relevant, because after I graduated from RISD, I actually ended up going a little bit into the nonprofit branding and communication space. I graduated in 2020 amidst COVID. The majority of furniture fabrication jobs are in New York City. That's sort of the obvious path for furniture students out of RISD. I didn't want to move to New York at the time. And yeah, ended up falling into this career path that a few years down the road, I realized wasn't really the right long-term fit for me. And at the same time, I started to look around and notice that my classmates and peers that did go down the path of wanting to pursue full-time careers as makers, how challenging it is for them to find visibility for their work and to launch their careers, build a client base, and figure out how to build a successful and sustainable career as a maker. And at the same time, something that felt really intuitive to me is there really isn't a place where you can, for example, search furniture designer in New York City and find someone like Hannah, or search ceramicist in Japan, glassblower in Denmark, and actually be able to connect with people who are alive today and making really beautiful work. And so on one side, you have makers that are struggling to make a career, but then at the same time, nobody really knows that they exist or knows how to find them. And I just felt like there was nothing really in our space trying to bridge that gap. And being in the midst of the fundraising process as a tech company, I understand that it is extraordinarily difficult to convince people who are now investing in AI, in crypto, in all of these like futuristic technologies to then take them out of that world and be like, hey, look at this glass blower, look at this ceramicist, and convince them that our industry and this market has a long-term value. But what I always say to people is, you know, ceramics, textiles have been around as long as humans have probably had fire, you know? This craft and these practices are really not going anywhere. And so it is more of a long-term bet, let's say. Essentially, about a year and a half ago, I launched the first iteration of Erria, which currently exists as quite a simple sort of visual directory of studios and designers from all around the world. At the moment, through the fundraising process, I'm preparing to rebuild and relaunch a completely new platform at the end of this year.
And what will be different about the new platform?
The current site is very DIY, I would say. It's something that I was able to build on my own with my understanding of web building tools, but really the idea is to create the best discovery-driven marketplace focused specifically for independent makers. So essentially a place where those makers can create and manage their own profiles, manage the pipeline of orders, communicate with clients. Down the road, really starting to think about what needs to exist for this category of small businesses beyond just visibility and discovery. The growth trajectory of the platform, incorporating project management tools, client relationship management tools. So creating, sort of crafting this ecosystem that's really specific to this category of creative small businesses, I would say. And I met Hannah because, well, we talked for the first time probably about a year ago, or maybe early.
No, I think about a year ago.
At some point.
It was
yeah,
cold
about
in
a
the
year
studio
ago
when we chatted.
I, at the time, was doing a lot of cold outreach to designers, and I believe that Hannah was one of the folks I emailed at the time. We connected, had an introductory conversation, and then in September of last year, I had the opportunity to curate a booth for a design fair called Collectible. It was their first iteration of the fair in the US in New York City, and Hannah was one of the designers that I included in my booth. It was such a special moment to be able to present work in person for the first time and to work with Hannah.
Amazing. It's a really, well, I think the site, even now, even if it's DIY, is really cool and everybody should go check it out. And I love the idea that you're going to expand both the ability for an individual, I assume, and or a designer to interact with the site and with individual makers, and presumably to create one-off custom pieces as well as whatever makers are, you know, have already made, but also to deal with sort of like the business side of it. I think that that's really, it's going to be a really wonderful thing.
I think last spring I did a series of interviews. I did 7 interviews with furniture makers and 7 interviews with ceramicists, focused specifically on their kind of career trajectories, whether or not they're making a full-time income from their practice, how they're supplementing their income, how long it took for them to get there. And this designer couple based in between New Zealand and Hong Kong, I was talking to them and I asked them the question, if you feel comfortable sharing, you know, how your income is divided. And I started that question and he was like, stop. He was like, you should never apologize for asking these kinds of questions. This is the kind of information that every designer wants to know and nobody is asking about. And I feel like still to this day, my interest has always been, yes, I love design. I love beautiful objects. But fundamentally, like the business that I'm trying to build is focused more on, creating a support system for these small businesses rather than to spread the beauty of design around the world. And I think that sort of slight shift in mindset where many marketplaces and e-com sites come more from the secondary mindset, I think is just changes a little bit the way that I'm approaching, the revenue model, the expansion of the features, and really kind of putting the sellers and makers as my number one priority.
Yeah. So in our first episode of this series, we talked with Dr. Anjan Chatterjee, who's a formative scholar on the topic of neuroaesthetics and neuroarchitecture. Neuroaesthetics is the neuroscience of aesthetic experiences. It's a field of cognitive science that examines how the brain perceives and responds to visual stimuli. And not just visual, it's also music and other things. But it seeks to understand why certain forms, colors, textures evoke emotional or cognitive reactions, and then is studying neural activity and behavioral responses in specific environments with the goal ultimately of understanding how we can optimize our built environment for our well-being and really to have the best possible outcomes as humans, I would say. Also investigates how biases shape our aesthetic experiences. They could be cultural, they could be, any kind of bias that you can think of, which is super interesting to think about. And a lot of what Dr. Chatterjee talks about is the science of neuroaesthetics and theory and application. And I'm going to direct this, Hannah, to you first, at least, that as an artist, I'm wondering if you are driven by what you feel inside that you need to make, or you are trying to create things for an audience. Do you seek input on your design, or is it all sort of like from your heart and your soul? You are trying to create a livelihood from your work, but it is also completely integral to who you are as a human.
Yeah, this was a question that I spent a lot of time thinking about. As an artist, I make what I'm driven towards. As a designer, the field of design is combined but is also separate from the world of art. Design is driven by the people who use the pieces, and you want to take into account who uses them. You want to take into account ergonomics. You want to take into account usability, ease of installation. So I think in that way, the world of design has definitely influenced some of the refining processes that I go through with my ideas, but I really approach things from the beginning as an artist. So if I don't feel passionate about making it, I don't make it. There are definitely things that I make that are flops, and you have to be willing to have the risk of failure, because without making something and having it fail in whatever regard, you're still learning from that. So I'd say things are definitely coming from me in a very authentic place. I work really backwards as a designer. Like most designers are starting with a 3D model and they're like, oh, okay, this is where I need to engineer things. And I'm like, let me work on this. And I'm like, oh, I got to add a support here, and so it takes me a little bit longer in that way, which is not necessarily the most cost effective to prototype, but is a very genuine way that I build. And, that's one of the things that I'm really uncompromising with is my vision as an artist and the pieces that I make. I think that there are many designers and artists who have the philosophy of, I want to build something for a specific audience, which there's no wrong approach. When you're running a small business, however you need to run a small business is how you need to do it. But I don't really do that because I don't think that that's what my vision is. And I also don't think that that's what my clients want. They're really responding to the pieces that I make authentically. And it's a small niche, but I think that that's what works for me as a solopreneur. And in terms of business, I never thought I would run a business. And so learning the ins and outs of business as a study and as a practice has been really interesting to me. But I'm really grateful for, one, the design community, because people are really transparent, and if you have a question, they will give you an answer and they will give you the resources that you need. And also in New York, there's a small program called Plan for Growth, and it's a business course that's aimed at creatives. And I took that in 2023. So, I've started my business in 2020, so I'm fairly new. Taking that was really insightful for me because it allowed me, instead of having an emotional connection to the business side of my practice, to understand how to structure a business. Yeah. And, I continue to work with Kim Robinson from 3 Points, who runs a marketing co-op. And that has also been really a game changer because he brings in experts in the field of business and marketing and sales, and I have access to those people to ask them questions. But in the same way that I approach my studio practice, I kind of approach my business practice because it's a site for learning for me. So my studio practice is consistently engaging for me because I'm always learning new things. I'm building new pieces, I'm building new ideas, etc., or even just refining the pre-existing pieces. There's always room for refinement. And so business has really become that for me too. It's really a rich site for me to learn. And I think once I changed my mindset from like fear of the unknown of running a business to now being like, okay, what do I need to know? It's been really kind of changing for me in terms of that. So like separate, but also together. The business I keep separate because it's a different entity, but it supports the studio practice, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. And Alyssa, I think for you, my question is, and this may be evolving, but how are you choosing who becomes part of your site? Is it that you want to have a breadth and depth of materials, of geographic or cultural sort of beginnings? Is it you want some furniture and some non-furniture? Like, tell us a little bit about what you're trying to achieve in who is part of the site and how you're making those decisions.
So I would say now and more going forward, the focus of the site is particularly on home objects. So anything from furniture, tapestry to, functional ceramics. In terms of the selection and curation process, I've always said that I'm not selecting based on any particular aesthetic. Rather, again, sort of going back to the question of business, and my vision for the platform is I want every maker and designer on the platform to be in a stage of focusing on that as their primary career or source of income, or wanting their creative practice to be a majority of their source of income. And I think having that be as a criteria generally ensures really high quality of craft, original work. They've made some sales, they've built some sort of little niche for themselves. In my current application, I say that the site is curated for quality and originality. I think originality is slightly more controversial and is not as clearly defined, perhaps. But something that also comes to my mind often, what a ceramicist said to me once, he said 95% of his work is purchased just through an image. I feel like these days, high quality photography is so important, if not even more important than the quality of the final object, because in order to create the final object, somebody has to purchase it from the image. My greatest criteria is you have to have attention to the quality of your imagery.
Something you both kind of touched on is this idea of play within a design process. And I think, Alyssa, you were kind of just speaking to this idea of there is play, but then there's a level of seriousness you need to bring to craft. And then there's this other side, too, of play is generative and it leads to innovation. And for you, Hannah, it seems like it's a really important part of your practice. And I'm curious for both of you, maybe Alyssa, for you, you've had to pivot and turn a lot with Erria. And is there moments of play or joy that you're finding within that, especially within the connections you're making with others? And then Hannah, for you, kind of speaking more to that play within your own practice and when you bring it to others to ask for Like, is this good? Like, should I make this? I don't know. Because I think that's a really important step in the process.
Yeah, I think, community is, the longer you're involved in the art world, the more important community becomes. It's always important from the beginning until the end. But I'm really lucky to have, my studio mate is my husband, Stephen Bukowski. And I'm really lucky to have his eyes because I really trust him. We've been having a studio dialogue for 18 years together. But also, the older or the longer you are involved in your practice, the more you really learn to trust your vision. And so we always have dialogue, over lunch, like, hey, what do you think about this? Like, oh, this little overhang here, maybe an inch this way. Like, oh, that bottom tube maybe needs to scale up, or I think that color could work, but, what about this type of finish? So I think that shop talk is really important and in any studio community, in any artist community. And I think that once you find people that you trust, that's really important to continue that dialogue because it's a really rich place of learning. So I'm really grateful when our friend Robert Sukerchand, who I designed for his company Pernbahn, the marble sconces, whenever he's in town, it's really exciting for me to show him what I'm working on because I just love his perspective. He's really got a great keen eye, but he's also a really good business person. And so he's always asking me really tough questions like, where do you see this going? How do you see this fitting in? What's the manufacturing process? What's the cost of goods here? Like really hard-hitting questions that, really forced me to pause. And to speak to your question about play, I think being open and willing to new experiences is really important to me. I think that play can be considered kind of like this unserious or unrigorous type of exploration. But I think that play is not necessarily unserious or unrigorous. It's kind of just this waved self-consciousness and permission to explore. And I think that my background in the fine arts really has taught me the value of that. I think that once you get a little closed off, you can feel like you can only do a certain thing. And it's natural in a studio practice to feel those points. But that's really where travel is important when I can get away, but also just removing the end goal and just engaging with materials or color is really important to my practice. So being able to just mix a set of paints. I mix a lot of my own pigments from, natural pigments or raw pigments. So being able to explore a new palette is really important for me because it just kind of gives me a physical process of making something and then a new way of seeing something.
Yeah, I love that.
And for me, I guess in this very moment, my mind goes to two things. One, I'm currently very excited to be working on a collaborative exhibition that's going to be opening in New York, March 20th. And it's in partnership with a gallery called Lyle Gallery, who I met Lynn, the owner of Lyle Gallery, also at Collectible, where I showed Hannah's work. We have a curation of over 30 designers from all around the world, each of whom is making a small tabletop or shelf top object. So anything ranging from a single spoon to a vase or a mirror. Most of the objects are under 12 by 12 inches. We have designers from, I believe, every continent, from Colombia, Guatemala, Lebanon, Georgia, South Korea, Japan, Australia. And this, even though I have gone down the path of working in the digital world very unexpectedly, it is such a joy for me to have these opportunities to be able to bring something into the real world and to also be a little bit in that dialogue. We have some designers who submitted existing pieces, others where it's more of a collaborative conversation between they know the material they want to use, but not necessarily the type of object. And so being able to be in those conversations has been really, really special. And I'm so excited for that show. And then I guess the other way right now that I'm finding moments of play is through the design process of the new platform. And we're going through all the UX design workshops and thinking about, the homepage. Is it as traditional as an e-com site? How far do we push it towards something that is incredibly minimalistic? And, it's kind of going back to what someone told me at RISD, pick your major not based on what you want to make, but the people who you want to be around. And I think at some point I understood that there is this threshold that what RISD taught me is to trust my own taste and to be able to create something from nothing. So whether it's a chair, whether it's a landing page for a website, the design process feels the same. And it's so exciting for me to take, this little world that I've built only pretty much in my own head and actually start to be able to put the pieces together.
Yeah, that's amazing. I want to ask you each how you define success. And I'm quite a bit older than all of you. And I feel like it has taken me many, many years to realize that success is actually in the journey and not in achieving any specific thing, whether that's like money or prestige or anything else. But I'm really interested in how you are each feeling about that right now in your careers. And Dylan, I'm going to ask you to answer this too.
When do you spend the most time with the people you love? For us, it's at home, around the dinner table with family, or sipping cocktails in the living room with friends. So why not make that time even more meaningful by imbuing your gatherings with pieces that not only make connecting easier, but spark conversation around your table? Amaton's collection of small batch, artisan, quality-made pieces for tabletop and home are not only made for simple serving, they're works of art designed for daily use. Whether you're hosting a dinner party or sitting down for family game night, our collections create a sense of presence and peace in every home. Shop our collection of dinnerware, drinkware, serveware, and more at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. Gather by Design.
Yeah, success really has changed for me. When I first started, I thought about success as like, I'm having shows. I'm getting press, I'm having shows. That's it. And I think when you're younger, visibility is really an important part of the development process. And now I think that similarly, success is defined in a much broader way. Obviously, I need to be financially successful in order to support myself. I need to also fulfill myself as an artist and be able to express myself through a variety of new pieces that I want to make. And success more and more has also meant that I'm able to take trips and relax and have a much better work-life balance, which I think is honestly such an American concept. It's really unique to the grind here, but it has really meant that I have the freedom to choose. And that doesn't mean that I'm not working. When you're younger and you start a business, you're like, okay, I can do what I want to. I'm going to come into work whenever. And then you get to realize there's a reason that there's a schedule. At least that's how I have found it to be. When I first started, I was much more flexible about coming in and doing this. Now I'm really like, okay, I want to have a more structured schedule because it allows me a lot more freedom in a lot of other ways. So I think success is, can I have a good quality of life? And in New York, that is a wild quest. But I do think that I do. I'm able to support myself doing something that I love. I'm able to work alongside someone that I really admire. I have a beautiful community of peers who I admire and who inspire me. I think that success is, has shifted for me too, but I think that that's where I'm landed on right now.
I'll give kind of maybe like the dry answer first. So last month I was able to pay myself my first paycheck.
Hell yeah.
Which I think that's sort of maybe the baseline. It is so special for just, I think probably for any self-employed person to be able to say that they've achieved that sense of financial stability for themselves. I think for me, again, maybe going back to the more traditional community where I grew up, where I feel like I grew up in a place that defines success in one kind of clear way, where it's like, okay, you have to go to a top tier university and then you have to, go get a job in the financial district in New York City. And I never identified with that. And so I feel like over time, I've had to build my own definition of success. I feel that I have succeeded in crafting my own path outside of anyone else's expectations. And that, you know, I don't really live with many regrets, at least not professionally. I set myself a goal no matter how big or strong, and I feel like I have succeeded when I have already started to achieve that, but it's not really defined by any exterior person or factor. Like, it's only kind of within myself. And having an amazing community around you, the amount of people, I've always told myself, whether or not this business works, I knew for certain that through this process, I would meet individuals that would change my life. And it was at the beginning, it was not primarily about the viability of the business because I didn't have that fully formed vision. It was about expanding my network and seeing how this led to the next step in my life. The people who I've met in the last 12 months, it's just unbelievable to me, the impact that they've had on my life. And I think having that kind of community is also just something I'm really proud of.
Yeah. Dylan, what do you think?
I mean, there's so many things. I think right now for me, it's clarity. I think especially as a designer, when you're making something, there's so many like what if moments, or is this done, or when is this going to be done, or I really want to make this design choice, but then it's going to cost this much and there's not enough of a margin, or I really want to do this, but I know the production is going to take 6 months and it's not going to get released on time. And it's really easy to get lost in the what ifs and the what to prioritize when. And I think instead just being precise and present in every single moment. And I've started every single day just like making a checklist of a really realistic checklist of what I want to do in the day. Like they would say when we study furniture, before you design a table, you know, you need to draw 100 tables. And I hated doing that so much. And I really let that go in my practice. And now I'm like, okay, I'm going to draw, 100 waist bins, or that's a call to something we have coming out. Anyways, I'm going to really invest time in this part of the process that I actually think is not that important. What I think is important is like nailing the details at the end, but investing that time in the beginning means the whole process is just so much easier. And I try to take that clarity into kind of everything I do now. How do you both think about creating opportunities for emotion or connection in your work? How does that extend beyond design and into process and fabrication and material techniques, as well as craftsmanship and tradition?
I think that that's like a really important point about design, is this emotional connection that we have with the objects that we use and that we live with. My focus this year is really to include as many small, important details as possible. How do you finish a bottom in such a beautiful way that when they're turning it over to install it, that's a moment of pause? How do you finish a corner that people unknowingly kind of touch it and have that tactile connection to it? So I think that creating or having intense attention to detail, and, every time I'm belaboring a sanding or a finishing, the phrase, the devil is in the detail, is totally true there, but it creates that really lingering point for my client. And I think that that's really important to think about these different touch points, because my practice is inherently really tactile. And that's really where I have always found a really intense or deep connection to the pieces that I live with, even from like an early age. My parents had this fringe lamp that was above my mom's piano. And having that tactile sensation as a kid, it was kind of like the same height as me when I was little, of like running my fingers over it and like listening to my mom play the piano at the same time was like such a formative memory for me. And so whenever I'm able to craft one of my fringe pieces, I always show my clients like just touching that fringe and having that really soft moment there. And so I think the tactile quality is the emotional connection for me. And similarly, like color has a very visual and tactile approach and direction in my work. So I think that that's really where the emotion and the connection comes from.
Yeah. And I think that's also where there's a big differentiator between art and design, or maybe seeing art and design in an exhibition space. The visitor is encouraged to interact with the piece, and actually on our kind of intake form for the exhibition, we ask the question of the designers of all the objects, is it okay if, the gallery visitors touch them? And so often in those initial conversations that I have with the makers, they actually want the visitors to touch the object, to experience the material. And I think that is such a special quality of experiencing design, maybe thinking about also this exhibition from my perspective, using it as a moment of education for a younger generation of collectors in New York City to be able to understand or to build stronger relationships between themselves and the objects that they live with.
When I spoke with Professor Chatterjee, we were talking about the evolution of actually being able to study what's happening in the brain while you're having an aesthetic experience. So he talked about they're just beginning right now to use like virtual reality headsets and collect biometric data. If this became like widely available, is it something, Hannah, that you would be interested in testing out with people? So you were just talking about color, for example. If you could have a client put on a virtual reality headset and you could show them some like prototypes of products that you're creating, and you could change the color, let's just say, and you could actually see their biometric response to different colors. Is that something you would be interested in trying and potentially incorporating into your practice?
When I first saw this question, I was like, whoa, that seems like an invasion of privacy in a way to get that data. My dad is a scientist, and so of course I'm like always really interested in the science behind our perception and our vision and everything else. There was this infographicist that my dad introduced me to when I went to college. He bought me the set of books by Edward Tufte, who at the time I think had only published envisioning information. That was groundbreaking for me to see there's an entire body of science between how we see and what we learn from that. So I think that, I'm always interested in learning from science. We need more science. We need more people who believe in science in every single field right now, desperately. I think that it would be phenomenal to have the technology to show people a space virtually and be able to change that color immediately. I think it would be more interesting to me to see that, not necessarily personally to get that biometric data from the person, because I feel like I have a conversation with my clients about how they respond to certain colors already, and I'm always really excited to talk with them about the way that the pieces exist in their homes. But I would be really fascinated to see what that does in like a museum setting, or if you put them in like an all beige interior, what happens there. So I would be fascinated to see, what that does to people. But I don't think that I would necessarily use that data specifically in my practice, aside from, just straight up asking people, like, how does this color make you feel?
I guess I wonder if people actually know the answer to that. So I would say, I think people know a fair amount. You walk into, let's say, like a salmon colored room or a beige colored room or a pink colored room. And I do think people will be able to say, I feel differently, and they might be able to describe it. But to me, what's fascinating about the possibility of collecting biometric data is to say, what is your body saying?
Yeah.
Like, are there certain rooms in my house that I would want a certain color for different
I understand
feelings? Like, now I want to relax more.
Right.
So I'm not going to have a bright yellow room or what have you. But what is the biometric data telling me about, for me, what colors actually help me relax? Or for me, what colors actually help me focus and think? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's so interesting. And the possibility of like understanding that could be pretty game changing for people in their built environment.
No, I completely agree. I was actually on the subway the other day and I was listening to someone talk about the field of neuroarchitecture. And it was such a great kind of like eavesdropping moment. I was like, wait, whoa, I know about neuroaesthetics. I did not hear about neuroarchitecture. And it was really fascinating to hear that because, like as an artist and as a designer, we know intuitively when something makes us feel a certain way, and we're able to pinpoint the formal qualities of a space that are like, oh yeah, that fluorescent light is horrible, or like, oh yeah, this room is like very formal and it's like very offsetting. But to have that, biometric data is really fascinating. So I totally understand what you're saying there. I think that I'd be really interested to read about it. I think reading about it will give me like the same suggestions. I want to know more about that as a field for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like for me, this falls into maybe some people wear, different like body tracking technologies, right? Apple Watch or a ring. I think there's a certain category of people that love to have access to that data and to understand how the science enhances their ability to connect with their own bodies and intuition in some way. I am maybe of the school where I feel like access to those numbers would make me feel less intuitive about my own body.
Interesting.
And this sort of technology might fall into a similar category where I don't know if I personally would want to know the science behind my reaction to certain textures, materials, or colors. But I was just thinking, I think in commercial settings, this could be really incredible for the design of hospitals, institutions, offices, where it's a more collective experience. Or maybe where it's, a hospital room, there's thousands of people that could pass through that one room in 1 year rather than something just for me as an individual.
Yeah, and we actually talked about that as well. And there's ongoing research, which I think is groundbreaking and could be so impactful on how can we design these public spaces like a hospital or other spaces to optimize outcomes and healing or rehabilitation or other things, which I think is so important and so interesting. So there's so much interesting research that's going on, which is incredible.
I remember having a really eye-opening moment, maybe my junior year at RISD. I was on a date with someone who did not go to RISD. And I brought him to the RISD Museum's student art gallery. And I asked him a question of, what do you think about this work? Or like, how does this make you feel? And he didn't know. It's just interesting because like in my surroundings, I communicate with mostly creative people. And so I think sometimes I like purely like lack exposure to people whose brains are wired in a different way. And yeah, it could be super interesting to see how potential technology could allow folks to understand reactions that maybe they don't even have the language to explain yet.
Yeah, I think that's so on point with what Professor Chatterjee was talking about. First of all, talking about vocabulary, like creating a vocabulary like a sommelier talks about wine and gives you adjectives and like fruits and other things that you can sort of like relate to and then what you're tasting. It's really no different for aesthetics and design. A lot of people don't have the vocabulary or they don't have any training or exposure. And he was explaining that even a little bit of exposure to the arts can dramatically change somebody's perception to art. And I think also just intuitively, some of us are just more in tune with things around us and how they make us feel. And perhaps these new technologies will be even more helpful for people who are not as in tune and help them understand the importance. Because the truth is, our built environment is affecting us whether or not we're aware of it. And I would think and I would hope that becoming more aware could help us optimize. So these technologies hopefully could be even more impactful for people who are sort of less aware and less in tune.
I think design is a really interesting bridge because it blends both art and function. think art can be sometimes very challenging for people to understand. I like to walk through museums with headphones on. Sometimes my experience is ruined by the things that I hear around me. And I think there is not, for many people, an obvious value to art and sculpture, let's say. But I think maybe an object, a bowl with a beautiful motif sort of blends that world of something that is beautiful and has an emotional reaction, but still sort of has value in a tangible, functional way. And I've never really thought about it maybe before having this conversation, but as design as being sort of the lower barrier to entry of the two for people to start to understand.
I think this is a question that I chat about a lot with my friends, and I also think about a lot because of my background as an artist. And I think that we inherently have a different connection to pieces that we use in our daily life because we have a variety of different memories associated with them, or the potential for those memories to form. Like a chair is obvious, you sit on it. If it's comfortable, you want to continue there. If you're at a dinner party and the chair sucks, you're like, I love this conversation, but holy cow, I want to leave. And I think similarly, like lighting is very immediately emotional for people. But as you were talking about a bowl, I was thinking about my grandmother's mixing bowls that my mom still uses. And they're nothing special. They're just Pyrex. They're like the solid color Pyrex bowls, but they're beautiful to me. And it's not because they're inherently a valuable object, but it's because of the memories and the uses that are coming from those. And I think anytime you have the ability to develop kind of a lived experience with an object, it naturally changes. The objects that we live with, the design objects that we live with, have multitudes of lives beyond the maker. And that's one of the things that I absolutely love about the field of design is once I make it, people get to use it in a variety of ways, and they have these very intimate and different connections with them. And it's not just about bringing beauty to a space, but it's about being able to really use the object well. So I think that it's, like there's always like high art and low design or whatever, but I think that that's such a ridiculous way of thinking about things. I was taking some of my college students last year on a tour of the Met, and we're looking at most of it, and I was like, these are antiquities and they're all functional objects. We're looking at bowls, we're looking at plates, we're looking at this, we're looking at that, because those design objects also carry a tremendous amount of culture. And those carriers of form and culture and design and pattern and, illustration and et cetera, that's what people are looking at to understand how people lived. And similarly with paintings, right? Paintings are a record of how people lived, what the values were, what the aesthetics were of the time period. It's just in a very different function. And I think similarly, going back to, this idea of learning the vocabulary, learning the entry, that's why I spend a lot of time when I was teaching, working on that. And kids are always like, oh, this is so ridiculous. We have to learn all of this language. And I was like, yeah, art is a language. Design is a language, because fluency exists at like every level, right? Like you can get by learning like one or two phrases in a different country. You're fine. You can order something, you can get around, whatever. But fluency there is very basic. And the more advanced you are in understanding any form of language, the more that language opens up to you. So I think that similarly, the language of design is also still unfolding. And we have such an interesting period right now with these small makers who are really investigating their like personal qualities and aesthetics. And yeah, what is the difference there? Obviously you're not going to sit on a painting, but more and more artists, maybe you will. Maybe some person is sitting on a painting. Maybe the painting has been designed to be sat upon. Who am I to say? But I think that we're also starting to see more and more artists kind of cross into this field, and similarly more designers cross into the field of art. So I personally love to see these blurring of bounds, because I think it makes the territory that much more rich.
Thanks for listening to an episode of On the Table with Ashley. Subscribing to, rating, and reviewing our podcast helps us to continue to record great interviews. So please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you're interested in learning more about the products we talked about on the show, visit ameatendre.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com to check them out. When you become a member by sharing your email on our website, we'll share special discounts that relate to products discussed on each episode. Finally, email us at reachoutanytime@ameatendre.com with thoughts you have or ideas for topics or guests for future episodes. Thanks for listening.